Behavioural economics on a post-it number 37. The Ultimatum Game. The Ultimatum Game is probably, I think, I'm sticking my neck out here, but I think it's probably the most famous game in all of behavioural economics, probably. And it's another of those games, like the trust game, like the centipede game, like the public goods game, that seems to show that people behave or are willing to behave fundamentally at their core. Many people are willing to behave cooperatively. And that this goes against the caricature, if you like, of rational choice theory. The assumption in rational choice theory, or what many people take to be the assumption in rational choice theory or standard economic theory, that people are inherently egoistically selfish. I think, as I've said before, I think that that's certainly a misrepresentation of what many of the great economists in history thought about human beings. If you went back to the classical economists like Adam Smith, and then you moved up to John Stuart Mill, for instance, they did think that people had all sorts of pro-social motivations. If you look at the Austrian school of economics that are heavily associated with liberalism, almost all of them, in my reading of them at least, thought that selfish egoism was abhorrent. So this idea that economists fundamentally believe in human selfishness, I think it's probably a relatively recent caricature of the discipline, probably from mid-20th century onwards, something like that. And maybe it came about, I know that I'm sort of digressing a little bit here, but maybe it came about through trying to make economics as a discipline a little bit more tractable, so that you can make specific predictions about human behaviours. If you're thinking that humans are hugely complex with all sorts of different pro-social motivations, then you trade off what's called parsimony, the simplicity of the explanation, which can be very helpful. But of course, if you have too many simplifications, then you perhaps move too far away from what it means to be human. Anyway, that's an aside. It's a related aside, but it's an aside. I'm going to talk about the Ultimatum Game. I'll just give a very brief example of what the Ultimatum Game, or a version of the Ultimatum Game, says, and then I'll say something about what the typical observation is from the Ultimatum Game. So imagine that you've got two individuals again. Just say that they're Tom and Harry. And you give an amount of money. You just give it. In this game, by the way, usually Tom and Harry would never meet each other. They wouldn't know each other. They'd remain anonymous to each other. And they wouldn't be able to talk to each other either, usually, in the typical Ultimatum Game. So imagine that you give an amount of money to Tom. It could be any amount of money, but I've just said £10 here, just for argument's sake. And then you say to Tom, would you be willing to give a share of this £10 to Harry? If Harry were to accept the share that you offer him, then that's good, and you would both go home with those respective shares. So say, for example, Tom said, I'd be willing to offer Harry £2 of my £10 that you've just given me, and Harry accepted that. Then Harry would get the £2, and Tom would be left with the £8, and that would be the end of the game. All right. However, Harry, and Tom knows this, Harry also has the ability to reject the offer if he doesn't like what's being offered, right? And if he rejects the offer, he won't get anything at all. But Tom would also receive nothing. So essentially, Harry would be punishing Tom also. They'd both get nothing, and that would be the end of the game. So as I said, you say to Tom, given all this information, how much would you be willing to offer of your £10 to Harry? Now, in rational choice theory, so the argument goes, Tom should be willing to offer a very, very, very small amount. In fact, say 1 penny, for instance, because as a selfish egoist, he would want to keep as much of that money as possible for himself. And for Harry, according to standard economic theory, if you like, then anything should be considered to be better than nothing. So, 1 penny might not like it, might not like it, but it would be better than receiving nothing at all, so he'd accept it, right? So the prediction would be that Tom, from standard rational choice theory, is Tom would offer, say, a penny, right? But that's not what you generally observe in practice, and you can imagine what you would offer if you were in the situation of Tom in this example. On average, people, in terms of means and medians, people in Tom's position tend to offer £4 to £5. So on average, people tend to offer about almost half as much as the endowment that they're given, this windfall endowment that they're given, right? And people in Harry's position quite often tend to reject anything less than, say, 20% of what the endowment is. So quite often, if Tom was offered £10 and he was to offer less than £2, quite often the Harrys of the world would reject that offer. Right? So why might this be going on? Why might this be the case that you get this result that's runs counter to the assumptions of standard economic theory, rational choice theory? There's a couple of possible explanations. One is that people just care about fairness in the distributions of what they offer. So somebody that's given £10 on average would be willing to offer half of it or almost half of it because they have this deep sense of fairness. Another, I think, more plausible explanation is that it is around the notions of reciprocity once again. I return to reciprocity as I mentioned briefly in previous videos. And in particular, negative reciprocity in this case. That is to say, the fear of being punished. The fear of if one is perceived to be doing something unkind, and that person that one is doing something unkind to might respond with unkindness of their own, right? So if Tom believed that offering a low amount would be perceived by Harry as an unkind action, then he would anticipate that Harry would return that unkind action or that perceived unkind action with an unkind action of his own, i.e. he would reject the offer and they both get nothing. Right. So I suspect that that's going on. You can test that a little bit with another game called the Dictator Game, which is simpler than the Ultimatum Game. In the Dictator Game, everything is the same except that the Harry of the world, of the game, doesn't have any opportunity to respond. So Tom is given, say, £10, asked if he'd be willing to share any of it, and that the share that he offers is just the end of the game. Now, if he was imbued by a sense of fairness, and that was also explaining what goes on in the Ultimatum Game, then the offer that Tom's given the Dictator Game would be roughly the same as that would be given in the Ultimatum Game, right? The punishment wouldn't be a real strong factor. But it tends to be. People still offer more than what would be predicted by standard rational choice theory in the Dictator Game. Many people do. Many people still offer more than that. Many people offer a prediction pretty close to what rational choice theory would predict, i.e. they offer nothing pretty much in the Dictator Game. But a lot of people, on average, they still offer a reasonably significant amount in the Dictator Game. I think the average, the median, if I remember rightly, is something like 20% of the pot. So quite a bit less than is offered in the Ultimatum Game. So there might be a residual fairness going on. But principally, I think most of the result that comes out of the Ultimatum Game is driven by the sense of anticipated negative reciprocity from one's partner, if you like, in the game. The final thing I say about the Ultimatum Game, and it's a criticism because this is the final game that I'm going to cover in these post-it note series. How realistic are they? How much what's called external validity do they have? How much do they really relate to real world decisions? I'll leave that question hanging. I accept the criticism that's often waged against these games that they're not, they don't really mirror the real world. But I think that they do perhaps, demonstrate that at the core of human beings, there are motivations in many of us that are very strongly linked to one's sense of wanting to signal that we wish to be cooperative with other people. Because as I said before, cooperation, if we can instill that, and if we can engender that throughout a population, throughout a group, then that will be good for the group, and by extension it'll be good for most people that reside within that group also. So that's it. That's the Ultimatum Game, Behavioural Economics on the post-it number 37.